Thank you. Thank you. That's a really wonderful and generous introduction. I'd also like to thank Professor Suan, who's an incredible scholar, a prolific and wonderful scholar on the Northeast, who's constantly pushing the study of the region in new directions. So it's a real honor to be able to speak with you all. Tonight, my time, it's 7:30 at night. And I will say briefly, I've had a little bit of a Northeast India day. I must say we've had like a flash flood in my area today from really heavy late summer rain. So I felt like I was sort of in Guwahati in September, walking through big puddles all day. My university campus was closed. I had to send everyone home. So it was all very exciting. Today I just wanted to give some excerpts from the book that Dr. Dolly Kikon and I wrote on Dimapur, which we really started in about 2015. And it's a collaborative project that we did kind of in between other projects. I just finished a book on Imphal, so I was really interested in doing more work on urban areas in the Northeast. Dr. Kikon, being from Dimapur, had this idea that maybe we should think about studying Dimapur as this kind of almost prime example of what urbanization in tribal areas might look like. And we decided to approach it a little bit differently than most things. I was going to do very much a visual or image-based ethnography of the city. And Dr. Kikon was going to do much more sort of interview-based anthropological ethnography. And then we're going to try and weave them together into a single book on the city. Obviously, the world had other plans. Dimapur was difficult to research in at different periods in that time, especially in 2017. However, we managed to do our bits of the book. We did some bits together, we did some bits individually. And I'm really pleased with how it turned out. The book itself is unusual. It's a bit of an experiment in lots of ways, like the city itself. And I think you will find when you get a copy of the book, there's a lot of images. A lot of the images I used for my material. Dr. Kikon used much more interview material, though we did some together. So it's a really mixed kind of different kinds of ethnographic approaches. And I just wanted to give some excerpts from it today. It's really hard to sum up a whole book in a short period of time. So I thought I want to focus on the bits that I think give us a strong rationale for thinking of different ways to study Northeast India, and especially urban areas in the Northeast. And these aren't always new in other fields or even other locations, but in the context of the Northeast, they certainly serve as experiments. We've generally, in the study of the Northeast, been used to quite conservative approaches, not necessarily conservative in the arguments or the politics, but using similar questions, similar frameworks. And often we only talk about other literature in the Northeast or in India. So with this book, we wanted to think, well, what if we took a city like Dimapur and exposed it to kind of current debates or trends in urban studies? What would it look like? What would we focus on? What would we uncover? And we use this duality of having Dr. Kikon, who was born and spent a lot of her early life there, and me, who knows the Northeast well, but doesn't know Dimapur or Nagaland very well. So really an insider-outsider dialectic, and thought, what can we say about this city? The book's really got two sections, two sort of large parts with different chapters in them. One's about space and one's about stories. And I mostly dealt with the space part. So I'm going to talk about that today. So I'm going to begin by talking about the idea of conjuncture and how we came to study Dimapur, not as a long history of the place, not as an analysis of its contemporary politics, but through this idea of conjuncture. I'll explain what that means in a minute for those unfamiliar with it. And then I wanted to talk about a key moment that really animates conjuncture in Dimapur. And that's around the collapse of a bridge. And it's the most recent chapter in the book. And I think it's the one that best epitomizes the kind of dilemmas of the ceasefire city. So I've got images up on the screen and I'll read along with them. So why study Dimapur? It's a really interesting question, and it's one that respondents in Dimapur would ask us all the time. Why do you want to study this city? Why are you paying attention to this place? Which in itself is very revealing about what people felt about the place they live or spend a lot of time in. I'm going to get to the argument of why we studied Dimapur towards the end, but I want to build towards it by going through some key ideas that drew us to the city. Dimapur's present conjuncture is poised between order and crisis. And I really mean poised. There are periods where it seems very orderly and under control, and there are periods where it seems to be descending into crisis. But it's not just about time, it's not just temporal, it's also spatial. There are pockets of the city that seem under order, and there are pockets that seem in crisis. And those pockets shift and change depending on the circumstances. It's animated, it's alive, it's dynamic. So the idea of conjuncture is important, and it has a long history in Gramscian thought and varies in different disciplinary approaches. And I'm quite interested in it in the way in which it's been kind of come through cultural studies back into kind of cultural geography, which is where a lot of urban studies work comes in. So for our purposes, we take a fairly loose definition of conjuncture as using quotes from one of the articles we cite, a complex formation of an historical moment. It's not the conceptual dictator, but an analytical tool to identify the many determinants of concrete reality and thus open up new possibilities for political interventions. Crucial for us is Stuart Hall's very well-known imploration to see things, to quote, not as you'd like them to be, not as you think they were 10 years ago, not as they were written about in sacred texts, but as they really are. The contradictory, stony ground of present conjuncture. So we were drawn to that contradictory, stony ground. And Dimapur, if it is anything, it is contradictory. The contradictions make it difficult to make simple arguments. They make it difficult to make simple conclusions. And for us, this was addictive. It kept this project alive through many years and through many different periods of fieldwork. This is essential for our research on Dimapur, but also for research on the Northeast generally, which can be characterized, not always, but can, by dated assumptions and some predetermined arguments, rather than attention to the conjuncture, to the circumstances, to the many determinants, to the stony ground. Some research focuses on limited causality. The state did this, caused that, people did this. Limited actants, just a few key players that everyone knows. And limited contributions to the conjuncture beyond obvious actors and categories. The state, India, the government, the underground, the church, whatever it may be. Dimapur doesn't let you get away with that kind of reading. It destabilizes that kind of reading so that you can't really rely on these categories if you want to tell stories about the city, whether it's through the space or the built environment of the city or the lives of the people who live there. So focusing on conjuncture asks us to analyze both continuity and change, the material and the social, as constitutive of the present, of all of this stony ground. So we're interested in the forces that have shaped contemporary Dimapur, even if we can't fully explain them. And in fact, we gave up fully explaining them about halfway through the project and thought, let's just try and explore them as a different kind of urban fabric in fragments, then pull together arguments about what we think this might mean towards the end. So we're interested in the way these forces have shaped Dimapur, the ways they manifest in the city, and the ways people navigate these in their everyday lives. And we group them into three themes. And those three themes form the subtitle of the book: capitalism, militarism, urbanism. So for us, capitalism captures the history of Dimapur as a supply outpost, a frontier between hills and plains, bound up in resource extraction, infrastructure expansion, and the expansion of the conflict economy. Following the ceasefire in 1997, capital has expanded rapidly and has transformed urban space, like the image you can see there. Former insurgents have turned to business. Migrants send remittances back to family in Dimapur from work they do in other parts of India to start business ventures. Money from resource extraction, coal and oil on tribal lands is plowed into property and other business ventures. And the easy money culture buoyed by transfers from the Indian government takes material form in the city, in large houses, small houses, cars, shops, etc. And Dimapur is an integral node in the recalibration of the Northeast from a frontier to a market for everything from consumer goods to personal finance, and especially education. Militarism traces the centrality of the Indian armed forces in the development of the city. Materially, as in a lot of the things that were built there were first built as military installations, and in the lived experience of the city socially. The military is not just a presence, it's an active agent in shaping the city and the lives of those who live in it and move through it. Military infrastructure, which is developed in a sense, more so than civilian infrastructure, technology advanced, gated behind big walls, gates, guards, etc., is juxtaposed with the city's civilian infrastructure, which is often broken, uneven, impractical, and again contrasted with community infrastructure, which is often the efforts of customary authorities, local communities to fix things, improvise. It's pragmatic. It tries to fill the gaps that are left behind by the municipality and the military, fixes pipes, builds new footpaths, creates do-it-yourself solutions to urban problems. The size and scale of the military infrastructure in Dimapur is astounding. And you get this feeling when you walk through the city again and again and again and again and again about how much space is taken up by military barracks and other installations, housing, etc., transit camps. These encampments serve both to normalize the military presence as part of the fabric of the city and as a concealer of violence. And a lot of work in other contexts, say, for example, Jaffna in Sri Lanka, talks a lot about this, about normalizing violence in a city through this presence. Dimapur is militarized outside the barracks too. Any space is open to the armed forces under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, about which many people here probably know a lot. And the military can go where they please, public and private, street and house, market and pathway. But what makes Dimapur a little bit different is that outside the city itself, soldiers of the NSCNIM are housed in Camp Hebron, and the NSCNU live in Camp Vihoku, sites that function as both the settlement and the offices of these parallel governments. These encampments loom over the city. Taxation and other payments paid in the city goes out to these camps. They're more than just sites on the edge. They're part of the city itself. They're mini cities on its edge. But why this matters is that unlike many other parts of the Northeast and many other parts of the world, in a post-conflict city, armed forces, former insurgents, their kin groups, clan members, and families all exist in the one city. Throughout it, they shape its urban environment as members of communities, as activists, as politicians, as capitalists. Some thrive, some struggle. But the point here is that all sides in a long-running conflict live in this city, making claims and counterclaims on urban space, on symbols of sovereignty, and on who does what, when, where, and at what cost. And finally, urbanism. We use this as an umbrella term for both the near and far processes. So what I mean by that are things that are generated locally and things that come from further away, whether it's through state or private investment, that make Dimapur look and function like a city, or in a way a city should look. An urban focus at the national level in India, particularly since 2014, has redirected development towards urban local bodies through various schemes and institutional restructuring. And this has been controversial. At the same time, the dismantling of the Planning Commission in 2015 has major implications for the Northeast and for a state like Nagaland, which depended a lot as the main source of annual budget on the Planning Commission's grants as a Category 1 state. So here, there's less money coming to the region as before, in theory, through different channels. And a lot of it is coming to cities. So you need to make things more city-like, make small areas into municipalities, and enlarge the area under municipal acts to demonstrate the need for more funds. So this has given new impetus to states in the region to gain funds for urban development by making urban areas in the frontier more city-like. Obviously, this has major implications for a city the size and importance of Dimapur. There are also local drivers of urbanism, including the revised Naga Municipal Act, reviving a formerly weak kind of governance in India generally and in the Northeast in particular, which involves reclassifying areas that were once rural as urban and threatening customary authority. And so that's why the revised Municipal Act was such a source of tension and violence, as many of you no doubt remember, back in 2017, a period where we were both actively doing fieldwork in the city. Most areas of the city away from the commercial center operate more or less as villages, despite being urban in form, and many of them are governed by customary authority under customary law. Governing neighborhoods as villages in the city can be highly effective. In fact, it's often a really good thing in some areas, but it can be ineffective in others. The locality Gambara, or the headman, is the go-to person for all kinds of things, ranging from attesting documents, getting proof of residence, to resolving disputes between neighbors, boundary disputes, especially in urban areas. However, work that requires more expensive infrastructure and expertise, sanitation work, garbage collection, maintaining sewage, falls outside customary authority and their capacity, even when there's a willingness. The municipal authority is supposed to take up that slack, but often they don't have the will or capacity. And so infrastructure needed, like pipes, roads, and wires, often fall down in different parts of the city, or will stop at one area and not be picked up in another. Urbanism is not solely about governance, though. It's about making order by policing space, marking boundaries within the city and on its edges. And in this case, I want to talk about creating showpiece development. And it is about the ways in which Dimapur's residents respond, resist, and mark place from below. This pictures of City Tower, a steel tower in the middle of a traffic island, one of the few traffic islands in the city. This forms the showpiece intersection where banks, billboards, and the city's prized Pizza Hut and KFC face one another. The tower itself resembled a scaled down imitation of sort of an imitation Eiffel Tower. It's also known as Clock Tower or City Clock Tower in reference to the slim digital clock on the upper panels, replacing the original analog clock face. City Tower is a landmark. It's hung with advertising hoardings, banners announcing community events like faith healings and season's greetings at Christmas, and a few meek municipality signs lower down about keeping the city clean. You can actually see them in this photograph depending on your screen. There's a green one down the bottom about clean and green, but it's dwarfed around all the advertising hoardings, etc., etc. Residents gather here. It's an important place. It's a gathering place. You celebrate New Year's Eve here. It's hosted music concerts, prayer meetings, and protests. And it's where the mutilated body of suspected rape suspect Saeed Khan was taken and hung on a perimeter fence after being dragged naked through the city in March 2015. Photographs of the night show locals, almost all men in the photographs, climbing high up the tower and surrounding it, preventing security forces from getting to the body. The site was likely chosen because of its centrality, but also because of the statement that could be made. The image of the beaten body hanging from the fence are a reminder to residents of the fragility of Dimapur's urban order, something to consider every time one passes the tower. But it's not always gruesome. Following the death of Ishak Swu in mid-2016, the tower became a site of vigil, with banners of Swu's photograph hanging down the sides of the tower and mounted on the fence surrounding it. Mourners brought candles to the site and placed them on the fence and the lower levels of the tower. The tower was transformed into a deeply spiritual site, reflecting the deep sense of loss among many people in Dimapur, but also indicating the counter-sovereign claims being made in the city. So the head of a parallel state, a government in exile, was memorialized on the main infrastructure of the city, built with public money. Images of the vigil from the local press show a striking juxtaposition. The face of a lifelong fighter for Naga independence next to an advertisement for an Indian mobile phone company. The vigils for Swu's death brought crowds to City Tower once again, this time in remembrance of heroism and shared struggle, a cleansing of the tower and perhaps the city's soul, a year after the lynching. These kinds of juxtapositions are what we're interested in, and the city's full of them. There are hundreds of them, there are thousands of them, on every corner, on every street, in every locality. There are juxtapositions and fragments of urban life that are just irresistible. They're just too hard to ignore. So we grouped them: capitalism, militarism, and urbanism. And they've shaped the present order and are shaped by the present order. They have Dimapur poised between becoming a model for urban development in the region and descending into crisis. Picking apart these elements through reading the materials, so the built environment, the objects, the towers, the statues, the buildings, the signs, and the social worlds of the city, the interviews, the life stories, the experiences, are the main part of the book. We're interested first in the way the space is shaped and then how people navigate it, and the stories they tell in the lives they live in their city, its order, its conjuncture, and its disjuncture. And we hold that ethnographic approaches animate conjunctures by unraveling the ways people experience a particular moment in time, a particular period in life, a particular period in the history of a city and a larger region. It shapes their subjectivities and their agency. Indeed, in Dimapur, the conjuncture is not simply the result of things being done to the frontier by India and before that by the British, but things that happen in the frontier, caused by an array of subjects with varied forms of agency. And I'm going to spend the main bit of my talk now just illustrating this through one example. So I want to tell this story through an example that comes from the last chapter of the book. In July 2017, a bridge connecting United Naga village, which you can see the welcome gate up there on the hill, to the rest of Dimapur collapsed into the Chate River. 4 people were killed and 5 were injured as the supporting pylons in the middle of the bridge were washed away in the flow of the rain-bloated river. The road across from the bridge was sliced in half and vehicles collapsed on the half of the river that dropped in, on the half of the bridge that dropped into the river, and other vehicles were stuck on the other side, wedged against the rest of the structure. It was really horrific. Built in 1988 as a single-lane bridge for lightweight traffic, use of the bridge increased as the city grew. And as United Naga village grew on the eastern side of the river, and as the city extended beyond it into the east, into parts of Assam and into the foothills, the bridge received a lot of daily traffic again and again and again until eventually collapsing. Amateur videos shot on cell phones of the bridge collapse were quickly uploaded to YouTube and shared on other social media platforms. In some videos, bystanders can be heard weeping over the general din of shouting and the sound of rushing water. In others, the owners of the video clip have added music and subtitles with facts about the incident and about the bridge itself. The videos and images of the bridge collapse invited streams of comments in various languages expressing anger, frustration, and sadness, but rarely surprise. When viewing these videos online, the algorithmic prompts of YouTube and other video services give you suggestions for similar content. I'm sure you're used to this when you view anything online. When you watch these videos, you get suggested whole videos. In fact, there's a whole genre of videos that focus on the terrible condition of almost everything in Nagaland. You can spend hours looking at footage of Nagaland state transport buses bogged in deep mud, footage of cracks in government buildings spewing forth water in the rainy season, and many, many dilapidated bridges still being used, lurching under auto rickshaws, cars, and small trucks. The collapse of the Naga United Village Bridge was a catalyst for public outrage. It didn't pass quietly. People were furious. Most residents of the area knew the bridge was in terrible condition and would likely collapse at any moment. So too did the Public Works Department, which reported the bridge as unsafe for commuting back in 2015, 2 years before it collapsed. The Public Works Department claimed that the bridge became unsafe due to sand mining activities in the river for cement and other construction needs for the booming city. Directing blame to the construction industry, its notorious greed, and the faceless, but certainly not raceless, low-end laborers mining along the riverbanks, rather than the authorities charged with building and maintaining infrastructure. It was an easy target to blame sand mining, but perhaps it's true. Perhaps this was a big factor. But also perhaps the bridge epitomizes the argument we make throughout our book, which is that Dimapur looks like a city, certainly at one level, but it doesn't function as one, at least not often. It's more an experimental territorial form, an enclave of gathered settlements with a limited sense of shared place and a limited capacity to be governed cohesively. After the collapse, local press also revealed that funding for a new bridge had been sanctioned in 2015 after the government of Nagaland appealed to the Ministry of Roads and Transportations in Delhi, a standard practice in the region, with limited prospects to raise revenue, especially for municipal governments. You ask for money and wait. Waiting for funds from Delhi may not always be financially necessary, but it's deeply embedded politically. But when the funds actually come through, there's only a slim chance they'll be utilized for their intended purpose. Indeed, once the bridge collapsed, the Central Nagaland Tribes Council alleged that the Public Works Department had drawn on the funds for the bridge 62 times between mid-2016 and mid-2017, yet no work was undertaken. Then the bridge collapsed, people died, and the eastern edge of the city was cut off from the rest of Dimapur for almost a year. The outrage was understandable, though it's what happens next that says so much about Dimapur. In early 2018, 6 months after the collapse, Dr. K.K.Suan and I visited the site together on an early winter morning. It was a really beautiful day, you can see in the photo, and the water level in the riverbed below was really low because it was winter, so vehicles were able to drive down to the riverbank and use a makeshift bridge built on top of sandbags and concrete pipes to get across to the other side. They churned through dust and dirt, ascending the opposite bank, and everything was covered in dust. In the dry riverbed below, crew of workers, all non-tribal laborers, assembled grids of bamboo and lowered them into deep holes sunk into the ground for the eventual pouring of concrete for the replacement bridge on top of the rebar. The site could be viewed from all angles from a suspended footbridge running parallel to the former bridge, wide enough only to get past on foot. Most of the original bridge had been removed, though ruins remained. On the Nagi United Village side, which you can see in this picture, a section of the old bridge lay marooned on top of a tall concrete pylon, cut off from the empty space where the bridge once stood, though still connected to the village on the far bank. So the gate that you see is here, and then there's this big hole there. Where the bridge would have once met the bank, a beautiful village gate stands with the sign, "Welcome to United Naga Village." Established February 8th, 1968, affixed to the steel and timber roof, an entry point now inaccessible without traversing the eroding bank pulled away by the collapsed bridge. On the reverse side of the gate, the side facing the village through which vehicles would have once traveled across the river to the rest of Dimapur, a white and blue sign reads, "Safe journey," a now impossible task with a sheer drop only meters away. The sides of the gate have finely crafted Naga motifs set in thick concrete pillars, and a marble sign embedded in the gate honors the laying of the foundation stone for the construction of this version of the gate in 2011, ironically, by the Deputy Transport Commissioner of the Government of Nagaland. Safety rails were still intact on the side of this maroon patch of bridge facing the river, as if the small section was purposefully left as a memorial to civilian tragedy and government ineptitude, though it's more likely no one has worked out how to take this part of the bridge down. Along with new signs by the village council reminding visitors and residents of the alcohol ban and fines administered for the council by the council for littering, the site is covered with messages printed on white A4 paper. Glued to trees, poles, bamboo hoardings. Some examples include, "Have a vision, make the right decision. Bad officials are elected by good citizens who do not vote for the right candidate." Due to pathetic road condition for more 15 years, citizens have already memorized the potholes in every corner of Nagaland. No proper drainage system in Nagaland because there is no system. Nagaland itself has become a drainage. Pollution by corruption leads to destruction. Be honest and fight corruption. And they're all over the place. The photos here are just a few of them. They're everywhere. These were all attributed to the Dimapur branch of the Aam Aadmi Party, in power in Delhi at the time. Our visit occurred just a month prior to the Nagaland state elections in 2018, and thus the collapsed bridge was an opportune site for one of the smaller parties to paste its campaign notices for anyone passing by and try and gain some popularity and traction. Though with the bridge collapse, there wasn't much traffic. It wasn't an area you could get to easily. And as a side note, the Nagaland branch of the Aam Aadmi Party merged with the Nagaland People's Front in late 2018 after failing to win a single seat in the 2018 election. So it stands to reason that the party that identifies almost solely as an anti-corruption group would choose this site, the site you see here, to symbolize their campaign. Surely it's straightforward. The collapsed bridge epitomizes the corruption that beleaguers the state. But yet, it's also striking they performed so poorly in the election just 1 month later. The collapsed bridge may have been symptomatic of blatant corruption and government failure. Yet perhaps these are things residents of Dimapur have come to expect from the state, or at least come to expect in the patches of the city where the state exercises control over space. And certainly this would come up again and again and again, a lack of surprise when things break down, are not repaired. In fact, it's not a surprise that the bridge collapsed at all. The surprise comes when something was actually done about it. Anti-corruption sentiment is widespread in Dimapur. It appears in graffiti, it appears on car bumper stickers, it's widely reported in the media openly often, and debated in political arenas. Yet elections are not won and lost on this. Elections are won and lost on the promise made to channel more funds to the frontier, to deepen dependency, to turn the tap on harder, to ensure the protection of customary laws and avoid any threat to hard-won entitlements. It's about more dependency, not the capacity to solve these problems. So as a catalyst for public outrage, the collapsed bridge continued to be present, even in ruins. It was a signifier for everything that had gone bad. But yet 10 months after its collapse, a temporary bridge was installed, And, like its predecessor, it's a prefabricated Bailey Bridge with a single traffic lane. It's the same kind of bridge that was put there initially for the same level of traffic, and surely it will suffer the same fate. At the opening of the temporary bridge in May 2018, a ceremony was held, which was attended by the Village Council of Nagi United Village and members of the Public Works Department. Prayers were led by Reverend Dr. P. Dozo, and at the end of May, an open letter appeared in the Eastern Mirror newspaper titled Appreciation to the Public Works Department, Roads and Bridges, Nagaland, signed by notable public figures impacted by the bridge collapse, including school principals and village council members from Nagi United Village and the settlements beyond. The letter is probably sincere, but it could easily be read as satire. The authors express profound gratitude to the Public Works Department for completing the temporary bridge, and to quote, against all apprehensions we had that this project would never be actualized. After the bridge collapsed, these villages were, to quote, totally cut off from the mainland, meaning the rest of Dimapur, which produced a great deal of suffering and hardship. They refer to the temporary bridge as a lifeline, a great achievement that shows a concern for public welfare. Oops. Along with naming key civil servants involved, the letter thanks the members of the affected villages and those who prayed for the bridge's completion. The letter casts the temporary bridge as remarkable, but also a little magical. And the very public gratitude may prove to be valuable when the next dire infrastructural situation arises. So as loudly as residents of Dimapur may grumble about corruption, patronage appears to be a much more reliable strategy than resistance, shaming, or political activism. The gratitude expressed in the letter also reflects the gravity of the bridge collapse. And this is symptomatic of the patchwork city of Dimapur, where the infrastructure connecting villages, colonies, and settlements that constitute its parts is unreliable and even ethereal. Sometimes people think something's there's a way to connect, and it's gone. Nagi United Village and the settlements to the east had one feasible route into the rest of the city, and you're looking at it now. When it collapsed, they were almost completely isolated and cut off from the rest of the city. In fact, to get to Dimapur, they had to cross into Assam and back out again, which sometimes means checkpoints, identity, etc. Unlike the community infrastructure fashioned in neighborhoods and settlements to compensate for the failures of government, which you can see throughout the city, building a bridge is a big task for community members, especially once the water level began to rise and the improvised temporary bridge along the riverbed in the winter months could not be used. Almost a year after the bridge collapsed, the provision of a prefabricated temporary bridge was celebrated, not just because it made the lives of residents much easier and even more possible, but because the Public Works Department actually fixed something. This warrants a public outpouring of gratitude. The fact the very same department was accused of ignoring the original problem and of appropriating funds allocated to fix it is less remarkable. That's not a story in Dimapur. The story is something got fixed. Dependency, corruption, and moral bankruptcy are the norm. Actually getting public works completed where they're needed is the exception. These acts, these moments of municipal responsiveness and action, provoke gratitude. They warrant prayer. They're magical events. They're important things to celebrate. And this reflects the way in which people experience the city and how they respond, or not, to its dysfunction. So I'm going to close by saying, here's why we think Dimapur is an important thing to study. For the largest city in a tribal majority state in India's much researched northeast frontier, Dimapur has almost no public presence. It's off the map, as we say in the book. There's no single public achievement, no shared public memory, and no contrivance about what Dimapur should be. The authentic Nagaland of festivals, tourism campaigns, culture, exotic costumes, etc., that doesn't even start until you leave the city, until you cross the river at Chumukadima. And that's where the big welcome to Nagaland sign begins, with hornbills, dances, etc. It's almost as if Dimapur is left out of that territorial imagination, a strange little enclave, left over but vital, the lifeline for the entire state. With no dominant narrative of the city to latch onto, Dimapur is experienced in fragments. Indeed, it was created in fragments. There's no shared urban sensibility to call upon when discussing the past because it's experienced as localities. Localities have history, The city does not. So it's difficult to discuss the past, the future, or the character of the place and its people outside these localities. And in localities where there's a lot of recent settlers, there's almost no public history at all. There's no city museum, no old photos mounted in a public square, no public repository of the areas settled and by whom. It's hard to find things out. You have to rely on oral histories, on settlement stones, etc. But this is remarkable. There are fragments everywhere. Oral histories of settlement, of events, of crises, visual archives in foundation stones, settlement names, dates on buildings, different religious buildings where communities have settled from different denominations, different faiths. And of course, the city's full of lived experiences, of personal memories, of violence, of occupation, of migration, of return, and of rapid urban change lodged in memories, bodies, monuments, and memorials. The city has an extremely rich visual culture. I've spent one fieldwork visit looking only at posters that were posted up in the city. It's an incredible, rich repository of an in-between place, a constantly changing and churning, demographically unstable city. These take time to seek out. They take trial and error. They take experimental methods, and they're worth it because studying Dimapur matters. And it matters for 6 reasons. 1, Dimapur matters because it's the largest city in a tribal majority state. This is deeply significant in Northeast India, where cities in tribal areas are growing rapidly and taking on renewed significance in economic, political, and cultural lives. So is Dimapur the teleos? Is it the endpoint? Is it what they're all going to look like? Or is it the exception? Is there no city like it? Will no city in the Northeast ever be like Dimapur? We believe that Dimapur is indicative of the kinds of urban futures that will shape the region in coming decades. But of course, we don't know for sure. And the book includes a lot of reasons why we think this is the case. Second, there's immense value in comparative ethnography in the Northeast, and Dimapur is a really good starting point. Yet there's also value in thinking of frontier urbanism or tribal urbanism as a research agenda that can travel beyond India and connect to researchers working in similar environments in Asia and beyond. Answering the call to better situate urban ethnography in indigenous contexts, in other parts of the global south, and engage comparatively away from the megacity to the small city, the growing urban form that is emerging rapidly, often with little planning and little resources. Third, Dimapur matters because it's more than just a city. It is an experimental territorial form. It's the economic lifeline of Nagaland, but it's also a swathe of territory cut out of Assam. It's simultaneously hills and plains, remote and connected, parochial and cosmopolitan. And as an enclave surrounded by Assam on 3 sides, the boundaries of the edges of the city constitute different legal orders that overlap at times, but are enforced at others. Extending the city means extending tribal territory, Nagaland territory, and the area under special constitutional provisions. A lot of other cities don't have that restriction on their growth. They don't have that tension at their edges. Outside the zone, outside this enclave, when you cross the border into Assam, there's the possibility of pleasures frowned upon in the city itself, especially legal access to alcohol. Legal access to alcohol. You can't get alcohol into it, but legal access to alcohol. The city is also an enclave. It's separated from the rest of Nagaland. It's left off the map. It's outside the images of Nagas as exotic and traditional cultural specimens, and of the economy generated by these imaginations, epitomized by the Hornbill Festival and other events. Dimapur may be Naga territory, but Nagaland as an idea, as a particular landscape, begins where Dimapur ends. Fourth, Dimapur matters because it unveils the coexistence and in many ways the cooperation between commercial, military and insurgent groups during the boom in the ceasefire period. Despite the city's commercial boom, it's still under extraordinary laws protecting the military and paramilitary. And there's a large military presence adjacent to residential areas, and sometimes even within them, and on the outskirts. There's also the ceasefire camps. And while the events and experiences of conflict in Nagaland and the ways in which it has played out in Dimapur are no doubt unique, they're no doubt special, they're no doubt particular, there are also other cities all over the world where similar dynamics of occupation, encampment, and everyday civilian life coexist, including in other parts of the Northeast, in other parts of South Asia, and in other parts of the world entirely. Dimapur adds to the corpus of work on these cities with its similarities and its divergences. Fifth, Dimapur really matters because it's been a city of refuge. The city has grown as migrants within Nagaland and from surrounding polities have settled here to escape conflict, occupation, extortion, and the flow-on effects of a long-running insurgency, poor employment prospects, poor education prospects, and a desire to escape bad memories, horrific memories, and follow relatives who've already been decamped. Its history of settlement and placemaking offers an alternative set of narratives of the 20th century in particular in the region. The questions, why did you come? Where did you come from? What's it been like? Are questions relevant to almost everyone in the city. Tribal and non-tribal, Naga and non-Naga, civilian and former civilian, male, female, old, young. Everyone has a settlement story. And if it wasn't them, it's just a generation or two back. Finally, Dimapur matters as a manifestation of modernity. In cities across the region, the urban is a crucial vantage point that avoids some common traps in analysing the Northeast and its communities, while also taking seriously the acceleration of urbanisation, the growth of cities in the region, the connections maintained and severed with ancestral lands in rural areas, and the complex interlegalities of producing urban space and metropolitan governance in these cities. As a final point, we end the book by asking whether Dimapur matters for the study of urbanisation in India. And we talked about this a lot. And as scholars of the Northeast, we're commonly entangled in this torturous task of having to give layers and layers and layers of context that can distinguish the region from other parts of India and to distinguish it from a generalized set of assumptions made about India. So prior to launching into a story about Imphal, about Dimapur, about the coalfields of Meghalaya, scholars have to explain the difference of this community from other parts of the region, from the rest of India, its place in India's mental maps, differences from tribes from this region, from other parts of India, differences between tribe and caste, internal differences, cross-border similarities, decades of conflict, conversion, reconversion, and various incarnations of identity formation, identity crisis, depending on what is thought to have come first. In a journal article, that takes up 3/4 of it. The extension of this task of constantly explaining and justifying into urban ethnography is to explain what makes cities in the Northeast different, and then relate what we've explored, our arguments, back to cities in mainland India. But in our case, beyond some accounts of failed infrastructure and corruption, which are common sort of everywhere, we find making comparisons with cities in other parts of India really difficult. There's actually little about Dimapur that would help you understand the way residents experience large cities like Kolkata or Chennai, or similar sized cities like Dehradun or Mangalore. There are obvious parallels with other cities in the Northeast region, particularly of a similar size and settlement pattern, Agartala, Guwahati, and of a similar mix of demographics like Imphal. And to other frontier cities like Siliguri, commercial, migrant settled, a lot of refuge from conflict, and Srinagar and Jammu, militarized, full of crisis, anxiety. But Dimapur is also really relevant for urban studies and urban ethnography for cities like Sitwe or Myitkyina in Myanmar, Aceh or Pontianak in Indonesia, and even Hargeisa or Mogadishu in Somalia, Somaliland. So despite advances in area studies over the past few decades that have challenged national and regional geographic boundaries, we as researchers of the region are still compelled to churn Dimapur and other parts of the Northeast back through national frames of reference, noting that scholars who work on mainland India are never required to explain how their work may be relevant to the Northeast, but we are. It would be easier for us to give in to temptation and offer a vague list of resonances between Dimapur and better known cities of India. However, we believe that cities offer us a better chance at liberation from the straitjacket national and area studies frameworks by forecasting Dimapur as a frontier city, a borderland city, a ceasefire city, a zone shaped by decades of militarism, capitalism, and urbanism, and a zone that resonates with similar urban environments across the globe, but perhaps not so well with similar sized cities in mainland India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Duncan, for that very rich and stimulating presentation. I really like the way in which you nuance, the issues of militarism urbanism, and for that matter, the way in which Dimapur as a migrant city, in fact, become a site of conjunctural events, which in effect is critical for placemaking in as much as it is about identity construction and identity protection. So let me take a leap from one of the powerful images that come through your presentation, as well as the book, which is the collapse of the United Naga Village Bridge, which in effect, as you rightly pointed out, reinforce the dependency, the corruption, or the unsettled nature of urban futures that underscore Dimapur as an urban city, which, as you both noted, never functions, quote unquote, like a city, right? So, in that sense, do you think that the dependency, which in effect underscore urban futures in places like Dimapur, and for that matter, other parts of Northeast India, given that you have about 18% of Northeast India as urbanized, compared to it something like 31% at the national average, do you think that it is possible to replicate a more prosperous, a more promising urban futures beyond Dimapur? That's one. Okay. The second point, which I think comes through very powerfully, not only through your presentation, but which also lagged behind in the book, is one of the powerful stories of the death of one of the military commanders of the NSC, Khodawiyanthan, which somehow we did not alluded to in the presentation, but which I think is very important, because the way in which militarism or the multiple actors in somehow defined or underscore the protean, the unsettled, the fuzzy nature of urban futures like Dimapur is striking to my mind. And it is precisely where the act of dying, in fact, whereby the corporeal and the artifact, as it were, becomes powerful, ways of defining belonging, in as much as it is about identity production in Northeast India and other parts of the world. In the sense that all Dimapur is seen as a home. For many, it is not home, but it is a migrant city after all. Mm-hmm. And it is also precisely powerfully, played out in the way the funeral service of Khodawiyanthan was enacted in a spectacular fashion, in which the dead body was brought for around 16 hours, brought to Dimapur in Hebron camp, and thereafter brought back to the Wakha district, in which he was finally buried there. So the powerful image that you see, the protean nature of urbanism, which in effect becomes a site of display of military powers, not only of the state, but also of undergrounds, and the way in which these spectacles inform powerful imageries about customary practices and rituals associated with such funeral services, which are instrumental not only in carving out a niche for groups and communities to construct Dimapur as a site of belonging, in as much as it is also a site of identity production, which in effect also shows very oppositional images as a place which is not yet home, but which is in effect a very powerful space to enact out the military powers in order to capture, the Naga nationalist imaginations. So I think these powerful images and how urban spaces become militarized, and how these militarized spaces in effect in turn shape up the content and nature of urbanism, and for that matter, the future of urban spaces in Northeast India, I think is very, very interesting to my mind. And the third thing which somehow did not come true, but which is there in your book, which I think is important, is about the cruel way in which Farid Khan was killed, and subsequently hanged in Dimapur, and that in effect reinforced the image of savagery, of barbarism, which is somehow embedded into the Naga psyche, and the way in which the summary justice has been enacted. And if you look back at the Constituent Assembly debates, for example, when there was this attempt to accommodate the distinctive Naga nationalist demands for autonomy or for that matter self-determination, there was this idea which came up powerfully in the Constituent Assembly that the Nagas perhaps are not meriting self-governance precisely because of the savagery or barbaric practices of meting out summary justice. And that savagery or barbaric practices somehow is not so much gelling well with the future of urban cities like Dimapur, where you have massive inflows of migrant communities, not only from outside India, but also from different parts of Nagaland itself. That Nagaland, if it were to project Dimapur as an urban center, has to be more democratic, more accommodative, more tolerant of some of the social practices, and for that matter, some of the evils or some of the crimes committed, irrespective of which identities they belong to. So in that sense, how do you see this type of images, which at one side does not augur very well for the future of urban centers like Dimapur. And somehow, in order to, as you pointed out very powerfully in the book, the contrarian way in which the Nagas, for example, see Dimapur essentially as a supply outpost, as a frontier city, as a site where the conjoining areas in Assam is seen as a site of as a site of immorality, as a site of moral debased practices like girls easily available for highway riders, so and so forth, and how the Naga identity is sought to be reclaimed and reproduced, not only vis-a-vis the adjacent Assamese communities, but also for other parts of Northeast India. And I think this brings me to the last comment, which in effect, as you pointed out towards the conclusion of your presentation, Dimapur is interesting in the sense that it is also a point where Nagaland begins. If the idea of Naga identity or Nagaland, the authentic, the original Naga were to be recovered, it is not so much in urban spaces like Dimapur, but as you climb up the hills into Sumu Kedimat, into interior parts of Nagaland, you'll find more authentic, more original representation, which of course, as you pointed out, is best reflected in the way in which Hornbill Festival is celebrated. So how is this mixed signals coming out, as it were, and how do urban cities which are unsettled, which are protean in character, and in fact could possibly navigate in the future in terms of this multiplicity of voices or multiplicity of actors which continually define the terms of political discourse and the terms of civility as well as communal harmony in these places. You may like to respond to this very quickly before we go to some of the questions that are asked by the participants, and we'll take them up. I would request the participants to post their queries and questions in the chat box so that we can take them up seamlessly as we enter into the Q&A section. Yeah, Duncan, please.
First of all, they're just wonderful questions. Thank you very much. They're really great, really thoughtful and powerful questions. And you've clearly read the text and engaged with it a lot. And I think particularly your recent work, like the territory politics and governance work, I know we're wrestling with similar problems, right? If you mark a space and you think about all of the overlapping sort of interlegalities, authorities, but also imaginations that go across and intersect that territory, how is order realized or imposed, and how do people find belonging? And I know we have similar wrestling with those ideas, and also the limits of legal categories in these circumstances. So I'll be very quick. You had this great point about, does dependency sort of underscore or kind of undermine urban futures. And I think it's a really big challenge in lots of Northeast states, especially in tribal states, for the simple reason that it's really hard to raise revenue. It's just really hard to raise municipal revenue because there's informal taxation, there's not much property tax, there's not much income tax. So municipalities is like the worst part of government, even when they're willing, they're just the least able to generate revenue. So they become really ineffective. A lot of customary authorities or insurgent groups or other groups, they actually take on that task themselves. They supply water to a Lakai in Imphal. They fix a road in a part of Dimapur. So you kind of have this really odd effect in that way. And although urban population percentages are low in the Northeast as a whole, in some states they're very high. I mean, when you take the whole, you always get Assam in there, which kind of reconfigures the number a bit. But in Sikkim, in Mizoram, and to a growing extent in some of the other hill states, it is growing a lot. So their importance becomes underscored. I think your point about the funeral scenes, death and dying is a spectacular point. It's an incredible arena, I think, Dimapur, for that kind of spectacle. And you're right. And I think you pick up what we're trying to argue well, and that this is how identity is formed. It's in how you treat the dead from your clan or your tribe or your group. And Dimapur is not necessarily the place where people would choose for their loved ones to rest, but it ends up by proxy becoming that, or at least a transit point. And so the funeral, the movement of bodies, the spectacle, there's a lot in the book about coffins and coffin making and sort of deathscapes. It's a really, really powerful part. And I wonder too if that's a symptom of what does it say about a place where identity is realized at the end of life rather than on migration or on arrival or on settlement? And I think it's a really interesting and a powerful tension. Farid Khan, I mean, I kind of, we have a chapter or more or less on that. I mean, the first two chapters are about urban crisis, and that was one of the crises. And it's a really difficult one, I think, in so many ways. And I didn't want to be too depressing, but you're right? It awakens this huge stereotype about tribal communities, Nagas, etc. They'll never be ready for state, uncivilized, I think you're right. I think more tolerance and more democracy, more voice. But in a patchwork city under all kinds of different rules and forms of control, it's really hard. But you're right. Intolerance to crimes committed by some result in extreme violence. Crimes committed by others result in a dispute resolution or something like that. But I also know that many people in Dimapur, obviously a majority of people, were disgusted and alarmed by this too. So there's this strange atmosphere in that city that it's both really parochial and then really quite cosmopolitan, or accidentally cosmopolitan in other ways, particularly in its commercial entity. And so I think crisis brings out that juxtaposition. The edges of the city, as you know, are an important feature of the book. The edges differ. On the Golaghat Road, the edge is really defined. Here's where Nagaland ends, church, border, booze shop. It's really, really defined. But on the edges, in some of the other parts of the city, the land is ambiguous. You might have a Assam State Police officer in some forest, and you might have a house beyond that that's sort of part of a Naga settlement. And there's a kind of constant encroachment both directions, a really vague and fuzzy edge on one side. And so in those edges, the order or the identity of the land, the territoriality of it is often reinforced quite strongly. They're fascinating areas of the city. And finally, I really like this last point about, Nagalim sort of begins there, but almost after it. And there's this idea of the hills, of villages being the kind of authentic space. And of course, right, people don't know what to do with tribal communities and cities. We don't know how to conceptualize tribal people as urban dwellers, even though many people are born in cities, live in them all their life. And that's understandable too, because the ancestral homeland is really important for everyone. But what I find interesting now is that when you go into the hills, the people working in the field are not from Nagaland a lot of the time. They're migrant labor from somewhere else. So all this pain that went into keeping control of the land. A lot of young people don't want to be part of it. They don't want to live there. They want to live in cities. They want to live in towns. They want to move to other parts of India, which is, as you know, is part of a lot of my early work was on that. And so who does the work? In the end, it's often migrants from Assam, from Nepal, from other places. And that's the case in other parts of the region too. But it's really interesting that if the hills are the authentic zone, when you're in that zone, it's often hard to find young people from the communities. Anyway, I'll leave it there, but thank you. They're really, really wonderful discussion points.
I hope, Duncan, you have a couple of minutes more.
Yeah, sure.
We
Totally.
can take up a couple of questions. This is a question by Mirin Kapai, and he says, what do you think are the ways out, or at least to resist the vicious cycle of corruption and dependency to build Dimapur as a better city? That's one. And there is this question again by Mirin Kapai. Could you comment on urban spaces that young people have carved out for themselves or related to the activities of young people, which might perhaps show how Dimapur would look like in the future? I think you can take this up. And along with this, I think you can also take up this question by Shivangi Kosik. Is infrastructure, the bridge, the only way of crafting ethnographies of urbanization in the periphery of India, that is Nagaland? How do spaces of knowledge production, like coaching centers or college, reflect aspirations that can provide us different ways of looking at urbanization? How can we embed urbanization within the subjective interpretation of the people here? Yeah, Duncan, please.
Sure. So ways out of corruption and dependency. It's really difficult, I think, because like I said earlier, it's difficult, like from a really practical perspective, it's difficult to raise revenue. From an historical perspective, it's easy to just wait and get money. And from a local perspective, the networks that depend upon that kind of dependency are powerful and they're quite thick, right? They're thick networks of actors who depend upon money coming that way, which makes corruption difficult. People are brave, people are courageous, they stand up to corruption all the time. But it seems to me the example of the bridge suggests that if you really want to get something done, you hope. And when it's done, you're grateful, even when what has been done is the bare minimum to survive. And that says, I think, a lot about how people view the state in a place like Dimapur, whether it's the municipality, whether it's the state government, whether it's the distant state in Delhi. They have like very little faith in it. So I think transforming that is changing, and this is what's really hard, is changing that relationship between people and the state and who's elected and what they demand of the people they elect. Because you get elected on the opportunity that you'll bring money to the locality, to the area, etc. Because that's one of the ways you can help the people who vote against corruption. They write things in newspapers, they name politicians. They're really incredible. Youth space, it's a really good question. We do have quite a bit in the book where we talk about music and the city as a city of music, and the way in which that gives the story a different narrative, I guess, gives the city a different narrative. It gives it a different presence as sound and songs about the city, but also the spaces that people, recording studios. So I went and did a lot of work in recording studios. Dr. K.K.Suan and I talked to a lot of musicians who write songs about the city. And we're really interested in the city's double life as a place of music and creativity. And then, of course, there's physical youth space, places youth hang out. And yeah, they're really, really interesting spaces of placemaking, of being, of belonging. A lot of young people set up shops, businesses, etc. And it's a really important part of being in the city. A lot of young people go outside, save some money, come back, open up a business, etc. And that's really transforming parts of the city in ways that are amazing. And this is where you get this cosmopolitanism mixed with parochialism. And it's also where you can have a city where you can have a lynching, but you also have boutique clothing stores next to it, right? It's these juxtapositions are so hard to explain. But I'm interested in how people experience and live with that. And they're the stories I think we try and get out. But youth space is great. And if you have a research project, I think really understanding youth spaces in different parts of the Northeast is a really good project to focus on. Shivanji's question, no, infrastructure is not the only one you need to focus on in forms of bridges, etc. I think the connective infrastructure is powerful and its failure is powerful, because in Dimapur, it actually physically disconnects the city really quickly and easily because of the way it's been settled without much planning. Coaching centers, yes, definitely. Hostels, definitely. All of these transit points and things that people are in for periods of their life that aren't quite home, but aren't quite where they want to go next. Yeah, these are really, really powerful. And I must say, we didn't focus on them that much in this work, but both of us focused on it in other work. I mean, I focused on it a lot in IMPHAL, and Dr. Kikkon's focused a lot of it on other work she did about affective labor. So yeah, we're definitely aware of that. And it's a really good one. But I must say, there's all kinds of amazing infrastructure that tells good stories in Dimapur. What we were really interested in was community infrastructure. So the way people just fix things because they know that the infrastructure is not going to get mended. We had like community waste infrastructure. It was amazing, really incredible. But also where all of that breaks down and how you can get lucky and have good community infrastructure filling in for the state in your locality. But if you live in another locality, you can be really unlucky and not have any of that at all. And so your fate is really ad hoc in so many ways. Your fate and your chances in the city, yeah, can be really down to luck, I think, more than any kind of overarching functionality.
Yeah, so we'll take the last three set of questions, which are somehow intertwined with one another. One is by Michael Hauke. How does insurgency stand in regards to urbanism and infrastructure in places like Northeast? Second, it's a question by Suan Monlianton Singh. It's entangled within the capitalist structure and its ensemble of social relations. Do you think that there is a possibility of looking at the distinguished temporal nature and patterns of development in Dimapur or in Northeast India as a detachment from the capitalist frame of understanding progress and development? And there is this last question by Haidem, who asks, how will the smart cities mission redefine urbanism in the Northeast? Can it be interpreted differently in the Northeast, where the region is still struggling with modernity as defined by industrialization era within the context of Northeast India? Yeah, Duncan, please.
Thank you. They're three really, really excellent questions. And stuff I've certainly written about in other ways, in other places too. So I like them. I feel like I can answer them. So insurgency and infrastructure is a really good one. As you probably know, as someone from the region, I can take by your name. But sometimes you have incredible infrastructure that's built by the military for the military. Sometimes you have military. Sometimes I'm surprised at really poor infrastructure in areas where the military is, right? Because you think they need roads to drive all their people movers and all this sort of stuff, and they need surveillance equipment. But generally, I think a distinction holds between civilian infrastructure, which is often poor, and the infrastructure of the military, which is often better. It's not always good, but it's often better. As cities have grown, especially a city like Dimapur or Imphal, they've grown around the military land and the military establishment. There are rare cases where the military's moved, like they're supposed to be moving out of Aizawl for the last 30 years, 32 years, out of the center of Aizawl. They moved out of Kangla Fort, but they just rebuilt bigger in other parts of the city. But I guess the answer to your question is that insurgency and counterinsurgency is embedded into the urban form in the Northeast. It's very difficult in most cities, especially in the hill states, to walk down a street and not see some of the infrastructure being used for surveillance, like a little tower with a person in it pointing a gun at you. With technology, and this comes back to the smart city question, there's more and more surveillance equipment, electronic equipment, CCTV, et cetera, about patrolling, keeping law and order, keeping people safe, but that's also used against the civilian population as well. So I think that the answer to your question is that insurgency and infrastructure are really intertwined. They're not the only reason cities look the way they do, but they're really, really crucial. The question about, can development in the urban Northeast have a different form, as far as I understood, like sort of a different form or a different understanding, different ontology of development than kind of just capitalist urbanism? I think possibly. I think that we are generally disappointed. This is where conjunctural thinking happens, right? Stuart Hall would say, let's look at what's there, not what we wish was there. I think we wish Northeast communities would have a kind of more inclusive, sustainable approach to development and capitalism. But often what you'll find is someone wants to build an 8-story house as quick as they can, block out the view of their neighbor, steal municipal water supply, get electricity from somewhere, and run a huge profit in some kind of business, make as much money as quickly as possible, send their kids to an IAS coaching college or whatever, right? I mean, I think that we need to give people we need to be fair and judge their dreams and aspirations fairly. And a lot of people's dreams and aspirations in the region are about getting wealthy, getting rich, having a decent life, etc. And I don't think we should deny them and hold people to a double standard and think, shouldn't you be into like the environment and purity and all that kind of thing? Like, I think that can be a harsh way to treat people's dreams and expectations. I take people's dreams and expectations at face value. I don't judge them for them. And I am disappointed with the way the environment in cities in the Northeast is in particular. In fact, I did this work on urban ecology of Northeast cities, and it was really depressing. But then I also realized that a lot of that is not in the control of individuals. It's not even really in the control of communities a lot of the time. But there is a lot of short-sighted, quick money development, and it is ruining the landscape pretty dramatically. I mean, even in a city like Shillong, where I did my doctoral work, so I've been going there for 20-something years, people still have an imagination of it as this nice place, but it's like completely overdeveloped and ruined, and there's no water and all this kind of stuff. And so I think we block out some things around this expectation that it might be different in the region, and we don't often see what's there, which is destruction, pollution, and if not private property rights, at least private property in act. But a very good question, and one I think that definitely deserves much more research. The final one about Smart Cities Mission, excellent question. If you are interested, I have written on smart cities in the Northeast, I think a year or two ago. If you look me up, you'll be able to find the article. You can always email me if you can't access it. Answering exactly the question you pose, which is, if a lot of these cities lack basic infrastructure, how can they be building smart cities there, right? And I think there's two bits to that. I think a lot of cities in the Northeast are quite clever. And in the Smart Cities Mission, they're actually not asking for smart technology. They're just asking for a lot of basic infrastructure and then throwing a few smart type things on top. I think most people would agree who've studied the Smart Cities Mission closely is Northeast was always going to get smart cities. So the state governments really just had to put anything forward. The huge challenge is implementation. But my big concern is that a lot of the smart technology, facial recognition technology, will be used to profile people. It'll be used to aid militarization and counterinsurgency in those cities. But the final thing I'll say, and I've done more work on this in Imphal Smart City Bid, pardon me, than others, but the whole idea of smart cities is opening cities up, right? You make them open, you open them. But a city like Imphal, that's the last thing they want, is to open the city. You know, you want to be able to control it. You want to be able to control who moves through it, where they go, what they do. So the idea of an open city of open data is really antithetical to how a lot of cities function in the Northeast. So I think my answer to your question is that it's a huge contradiction. I think that you can see a lot of agency by municipal governments who are getting smart and thinking, oh, we can get some stuff from this that will help, to at least get projects going, get investments going, give people jobs, give people work, contracting, subcontracting, etc. And you can also see some projects that are terribly scaled and inappropriate for the kinds of cities that are there. But please get in touch with me. I'll happily send you that work. And I'm really thrilled with these questions because, you know, like, maybe 10 or 15 years ago when I first started writing about cities in the region, you would never get good questions. People just wanted you to write about other topics, right? And other things. And you clearly, you know, really epitomize the change that people who care about the region think about it now in lots of different ways, lots of ideas. It's a really wonderful time to be studying the Northeast. And if it wasn't for COVID travel restrictions, I would like to be there in person to have these discussions because, yeah, the kind of questions you're asking about infrastructure, about smart cities, about ritual, about space, about corruption, about governance, the city like brings all of this together and shows it to us. And I think often we haven't looked closely. It's not the only space worth studying in the region, but I think it's a space we can pay really close attention to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Duncan, for that very rich presentation as well as elaborate defense of the questions or some of the issues that are flagged in the course of our discussion in the Q&A session. We would very much like to have Dolly along with you, but somehow because of certain constraints, he has not been able to participate. We look forward to having you here in the University of Hyderabad whenever you come to India. And we thank you once again for this very rich, very stimulating talk. And I hope that the participants would get to have a whole about the book, which I highly recommend it because of the subtleties, the sophisticated ways in which the complex terrain of not only urbanization, but also the urban futures in Northeast India has been so competently engaged and handled very competently by two very eminent scholars on Northeast India. We'd like to thank once again to Anaga and all the participants for their time, and we look forward to having you more in the future as well. Yeah, Anaga, any final words, please?
Oh, thank you to everyone, and thank you, Professor Duncan. I mean, it's almost time to say goodnight to you. But thank you for sparing time and joining us. And we hope that wonderful. Whenever you are able to travel to India, please do visit us.
I'd love to. And thank you for wonderful organization, wonderful questions. And if a lot of these questions came from students and people in your department, I mean, your department must be incredible. Like, they're wonderful questions. So head of department, you're doing an incredible job.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Yeah. Have a good